November 1916, the hospital ship Britannic was about to meet its doom. Shortly earlier, it had struck a mine laid by a German U-boat and was badly down by the head, sinking fast. Lifeboats were swung out and lowered, but the engines were still turning the ship's propellers in a desperate attempt to beach it. Lifeboats were dragged in and smashed to shreds along with the people inside. In one of the lifeboats, being drawn inexorably closer, sat one young nurse, and incredibly, this was not her first brush with disaster at sea. No, this young woman had been aboard Olympic when she had collided with a British warship, but most famously, the nurse had survived the sinking of Olympic's newer sister ship, Titanic, in 1912, and now, 4 years later, she found herself facing fate once again on the third and final sister ship, Britannic. And as the propellers drew nearer, she was faced with a split-second decision. At the last moment, she made a desperate jump for survival. That nurse's name was Violet Jessop, and this is her story. The story of Titanic is one that has transfixed humanity for more than a century, and it continues to capture our hearts and minds to this day. This channel is guilty of focusing more on the ship itself rather than the people who sailed on it, so today we'd like to change that by introducing a new series that focuses on the incredible lives of the people that got caught up in one of maritime history's greatest disasters. Today, we want to take a look at one such story with profound ties, not just to Titanic, but two other very famous White Star Line disasters. This is the story of one particularly plucky stewardess and nurse who would become the unsinkable darling of the White Star Line. Violet Jessop was born in 1887 in Argentina, the oldest of 9 children born to 2 Irish immigrants. Violet's early years were difficult, to say the least. She'd been diagnosed with tuberculosis at a young age, and she spent a portion of her childhood in and out of hospitals, which should have prevented her from pursuing her education, as she repeatedly tried to continue attending classes. Her health continued to decline, however, and she was finally placed on bed rest by orders of her doctors, who believed that the outlook was bleak. At one point, young Violet, weakened by disease, was given just months to live. But this was no ordinary girl. This was Violet Jessop, a girl with a penchant for cheating death. Once her family had relocated from Buenos Aires to the foothills of the Andes as a last-ditch effort recommended by her doctors, Violet's condition miraculously improved, and eventually she was entirely cured. Thanks to her recovery, she was able to resume her schooling, but despite this victory, life again took a tragic turn. Soon after their move to the Andes, her father succumbed to complications from a surgical procedure. In this period of history, medicine was still not yet well understood, and illness and tragedy visited the Jessop family often. The family had tragically lost 3 children to illness already, and those still alive were constantly fighting off one malady or another. It was while taking care of her sick baby sister that Violet realised her ultimate calling. Feeling frustrated and helpless to provide aid to her sick and dying loved ones, Violet resolved to pursue nursing as a profession. But fate had other plans in mind for Violet first. Her mother was, at the time, a White Star Line stewardess, but she had become too ill to continue her seafaring duties. So, determined to provide for her family, and following in her mother's footsteps, Violet began to apply for various jobs at sea, and before long, the 21-year-old woman had found herself working as a stewardess on board the Royal Mail ship RMS Orinoco. Despite finding the demands of the job physically exhausting, Violet seemed to take to seafaring life with a natural poise and charm that won over passengers and her fellow crew members alike. While this mainly led to warm conversations and eventual friendships, not everyone charmed by Violet had the best intentions. In Violet's memoir, she recounts how the captain of one of her ships had made several unwanted advances toward her, all of which she rejected. Her rejection would unfortunately not be the end of it, however. A few changes of ship later, Violet found herself working under the very same captain who once counted her as his favourite stewardesses, suddenly claiming to find her utterly incompetent. She was dismissed from the company soon after. After this termination, Violet sought employment at other shipping companies, but the companies she was truly interested in working for all rejected her applications. This left her with very few options, and she ultimately settled on employment with a company she wasn't so keen to work for, the White Star Line. According to Jessop, we in other lines heard much. Despite her reluctance to join the company, Violet soon found her sea legs on the White Star ships she was assigned to, starting with the RMS Majestic, and later moving on to serve as stewardess on the maiden voyage of the line's brand new flagship, RMS Olympic. This massive and luxurious liner dispelled any misgivings Violet might have had about her new posting. She was immediately taken by the new liner and her designers, especially Thomas Andrews, of whom Violet fondly mused. I sometimes think that maybe he imparted some of his generous personality into the ship he so lovingly designed. But then, in September 1911, the Olympic met disaster. The ship was steaming through the Solent alongside the British cruiser HMS Hawke, but as Olympic began her turn to starboard, Hawke's commander was unable to react in time, and his ship plunged deeply into the Oceanliner's side. Hawke had been designed with a ram bow, and this sliced straight through Olympic's steel plating. Fortunately, nobody was hurt in the impact, but Olympic was badly damaged. Her plating was sliced open above and below the waterline, and her propellers and shafting were badly knocked. It was a publicity and financial disaster for the White Star Line, and Olympic was blamed for the incident. It took 6 weeks to properly repair the ship, with some parts even being taken from the unfinished Titanic to speed the process up. Now, this has been the basis for a lot of ridiculous conspiracy theories over the years, but that's a story for another time. Suffice it to say, Violet had had her first brush with maritime disaster. Curiously, it doesn't seem to have had any real major impact on her at all. Violet didn't discuss the events surrounding the collision in her memoirs, nor is her role in those events specified in any other publication or interview. While it's possible that the sinkings of Titanic and Britannic were both of much greater importance to her later in life, it may just be likely that Jessop chose to remember Olympic simply as a happy ship, as she described her, and left it at that. She simply stated, "Time flies when you are busy. Certainly the first year of Olympic's life was gone before I was aware it was over, spent in the hectic rush which is typical of a new ship, until the novelty wears off and the fickle travelling public takes its fancy elsewhere." It wouldn't be long before Olympic's sister ship, the RMS Titanic, was ready to set sail, and Jessop would count herself among the ship's victualling crew. Like on the Olympic, Violet was chosen for Titanic as she was one of the company's cream of the crop, and she felt privileged to serve aboard their luxurious new liner. On that bright, sunny sailing day, on April 10th, 1912, the hustle and bustle of boarding the new ship and helping the hurried passengers settle in felt like a blur. But as Violet described it, getting acquainted either with people or a new ship is not an easy matter in bad weather, but in this case, nothing prevented the spread of harmonious peace and good fellowship. Life aboard Titanic seemed to be quickly settling into a peaceful rhythm, just as it did on Olympic, and Violet, though admittedly not the most at ease on a big ship, had little trouble adjusting to her new post. Then, one night, as she was settling into her bunk for the evening, she recalled a prayer offering protection from both fire and water given to her by an Irish woman who had sailed as a passenger on a previous ship. But upon realizing she had not yet recited it as promised, Violet placed her attention solely on saying the prayer, even sharing it with her bunkmate, and then once finished, she closed her book, reflecting on her devotions. But at that very same moment, Titanic gave a shudder. At first, she recalled a quiet yet inquisitive energy steeped through the ship. Passengers began popping their heads out of their staterooms, wondering aloud to one another what could have happened. But after a short few moments, Violet and her roommate both prepared to return to duty. While finishing dressing, another steward knocked on the door and asked Jessop, "Do you know that the ship is sinking?" "Sinking?" Jessop recalled, thinking. Of course Titanic couldn't be sinking, what nonsense. But of course, soon after, orders came down that all passengers and crew were to proceed to the lifeboats. The unsinkable Titanic would founder. Violet and her fellow steward spent some time debating on which coat or hat would be suitable for her to wear as the ship went down, but once she realized that she had brought nothing appropriate for the freezing temperatures of the North Atlantic, she swiped a silk blanket from a nearby cabin and finally proceeded to the boat deck. Amidst the chaos and confusion on the ship, Violet found her way quickly into lifeboat 16 at the after end, but not before a frantic stranger had foisted their infant child into Violet's arms, saying, "Look after this, will you?" Sitting in the crowded lifeboat being lowered into that icy sea below, surrounded by panicking passengers and holding a crying baby, Violet recalled thinking, "It all must be a dream." As the lifeboats drifted away from the ship, Violet stared at the spectacle before her in absolute disbelief, convincing herself that she could keep the ship afloat if she just never looked away. But moments later, turning her attention again toward the foundering Titanic, she and the others in the lifeboat looked on in horror as the ship appeared to right itself for a moment and then, with a mournful groan, rose up and took her last gasping breath. She went down by the head, Violet said, with a thundering roar of underwater explosions, our proud ship, our beautiful Titanic, gone to her doom. Thus began what was undoubtedly the most grueling wait of Violet's life. The night was fiercely cold and unusually dark, and it's easy to imagine feeling frozen in time, as though the night and its horrors would never end. The choppy sea tossed the tiny boat about, and the icy wind bit at their faces with no absolution in sight. But the sun did rise on that April morning, as it always does, and Violet, still clutching the stranger's baby to her chest, felt hope for the first time since her world had been turned upside down. A strange shape off in the distance was approaching, the Carpathia, their long-awaited rescue. Lifeboat 16, which Violet had occupied, was the last to reach the vessel. Freezing, exhausted, and shell-shocked, Violet climbed on board and scarcely had a chance to search the faces that greeted her before a woman snatched the baby from her arms without a word and fled, never to be seen again. Surviving the harrowing Titanic disaster wasn't enough to keep Violet away from the sea. She had grown wary with the work and less patient with insufferable passengers and their demands, but she realised that if she didn't return to sea right away, she never would. Just 2 weeks after the Titanic inquiries had concluded, she found herself back on board none other than Titanic's sister ship, the Happy Olympic, where she continued serving as a stewardess until the outbreak of World War I. Seeing the war as an opportunity to pursue her training as a nurse and aid in the wartime efforts, Violet enlisted in the VAD, or Voluntary Aid Detachment, a hospital arm of the military organised by the British Red Cross. Having already spent years at sea, Violet's aptitude for both nursing and seafaring made her a natural on board her hospital ship, the final sister in the Olympic-class trio. She was assigned to the HMHS Britannic. Upon joining the crew of Britannic, Violet was keenly aware that this position would be far different from what she had known of life at sea before. Serving as a nurse aboard a hospital ship in the middle of a war would be worlds away from serving the affluent, travelling public aboard an ocean liner, but Violet's natural charm and soothing presence lent itself just as well to this new role. As she and Britannic's crew prepared for their departure, there were rumours floating about pertaining to their ultimate destination. No one knew for sure, but some assumed Australia would be their first port of call. Even whispers found Violet of the possibility of a Malta landing, where her brother was in recovery after being wounded on the front lines. The prospect of a visit to her injured brother sparked excitement in Violet, but then partway through Britannic's first voyage, word got around that their destination was actually Mudros, a town in Greece which was near the site of the horrifically miscalculated Gallipoli campaign. With evacuations mounting in staggering numbers each day, hospital ships became integral to the Allied war efforts in the area, and sadly Violet would not be able to visit her brother on the first outing, but dutiful as ever, she turned her attention to the sick and wounded at Mudros. On November 21st, 1916, Britannic had successfully completed 5 voyages between Southampton, Naples and Greece, bringing the war's wounded back home. The 6th voyage was to be like all the others. Britannic would depart from Southampton, anchor at Naples for coal and water, and then head off to Mudros to bring the evacuee soldiers on board to be taken home to England while under the care of the ship's medical staff. On this particular day, Britannic was departing from Naples en route to Mudros, and all was routine. There were no patients on board yet, but the ship's staff were busying themselves preparing to take on another group of injured soldiers once they reached Greece. That morning, Violet was looking after a fellow nurse who'd actually fallen ill and preparing her breakfast and tea, but suddenly, while leaving the pantry, Violet felt the ship give a terrifying shudder, undoubtedly bringing her right back to the night of Titanic sinking. She recalled looking around the room and noticing that there was no panic, but instead every person in the dining hall rose as one, springing into action without a moment's hesitation. The crew, by this time, was a well-oiled machine. They'd been carefully trained for eventualities like this. No one yet knew exactly what had struck the ship, either a mine or a torpedo, but all knew that something was amiss. Violet snapped out of her daze and proceeded at once to the cabin of the nurse that she had been tending to and helped her get into a lifebelt. For her part, Violet grabbed a few trinkets and, most importantly, her toothbrush, which she regretted not having on hand after being rescued by Carpathia. She then dressed herself in a coat, proceeded to place her life vest over it, a faux pas that she had warned other passengers against in the past. A heavy coat could negate the effects of a life vest, but Violet assumed she wouldn't be submerged in water anyway, so she felt no real concern about skirting the protocol. She said a fond goodbye to her cozy cabin and headed up to the boat deck. Once up top, Violet quickly took her place in her assigned lifeboat towards the stern, and the crew began to lower it away. But as the boat hit the water's surface, Violet almost absent-mindedly noticed that all the other passengers on board jumped over the side. Looking around in confusion, her eyes landed on Britannic's massive propellers, still spinning wildly, rising out of the water as the ship began to go down by the head. Lifeboats had been sucked in towards the twisting screws, and Violet looked on in horror as anything and anyone in the path of the blades was obliterated. Having never been submerged in water before, and with no idea how to swim, it was now or never. Violet jumped overboard. Disoriented and cursing her decision to wear her life belt over her heavy coat, Violet grasped for anything solid in the blood-streaked water. When she rose to the surface, she slammed her head twice against something rock solid. It was actually the bottom of her lifeboat. Once she finally broke free and surfaced, she was greeted by a scene of chaos and carnage. Panicked survivors, dead bodies, severed limbs and twisted wreckage all floated around, and the backdrop of it all was the once proud hospital ship Britannic, listing heavily to one side with smoke pouring from her hull. Floating in the water, scarcely able to believe it was all happening again, Violet recounts the sorrow she felt at watching Britannic's last moments. With a final roar, she said, she disappeared into the depths, the noise of her going resounding through the water with undreamt of violence. Violet was fortunately later rescued by one of Britannic's motor launchers and taken to shore. After being tended to by kind locals, she was ferried off to Athens, where the members of the Royal Navy stationed there were so taken with her and her fellow nurses that a local newspaper article was published about them, fawning over their striking beauty and poise. Her stay in Athens was thrilling, she recalled, but she began to long for home and her family. Her life had been mercifully spared once again. Now it was time to go back again to begin putting the pieces back together. After a week spent staying at a hotel in Athens, she found herself on board the Grand Tully Castle, a ship destined for Malta, where she would finally be able to reunite with her brother at long last. Even then, after surviving the sinking of both Titanic and Britannic, not to mention Olympic's run-in with HMS Hawke, Jessop still couldn't resist the call of the sea. She remained a stewardess, serving on the Red Star and Royal Mail ships until her retirement all the way later in 1950. She had a particular fondness for her time on board the Red Star ship SS Belgenland, perhaps second only to her beloved Olympic. After her retirement from shipboard life, Violet kept busy raising hens, gardening and learning to drive. The disasters that she had experienced mostly stayed in her past, but Titanic had one final surprise in store for Violet. One night, just about a year before her death, Violet's home phone began to ring. Violet made her way into the hall to answer, and a woman on the other end asked, "Is this Violet Jessop?" Violet responded, "Yes, who's calling?" The woman, ignoring the question, asked, "Is this the Violet Jessop who was a stewardess on Titanic and rescued a baby?" The question shocked Violet. "Yes, it is," she replied. "Who is this? What do you want?" A laugh came through the other end of the phone. A voice simply said, "I was that baby." And then the line went dead. A prank call? Maybe, but Violet insists she never told anybody about the baby that she'd rescued that night when Titanic went down. Violet Jessop died in 1971 at the age of 83, not just a survivor of the Titanic disaster, but a survivor through and through. Passengers were taken by her comforting presence and caring demeanour, and patients even swore that she could cure a headache with just the touch of her hand. She never seemed content to stay on the shore, always finding one reason or another to return to the sea, even after surviving disaster after disaster. Her spirit remained unbroken by the horrors she had experienced, and even after being face to face with the brutal unfairness of life, she remained unshakably kind and empathetic to all around her. She's come to be known by history as Miss Unsinkable, and there may be no one more well suited to the title than Miss Violet Constance Jessop. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.